Peeling back election myths, I'm Brian Lilley with TheRebel.Media. So we've had day one. We're into day two of the election campaign. Prime Minister Stephen Harper calls the election at Rideau Hall. Then he heads to Montreal, to the riding of Mount Royal. Going back historically, this was the riding held by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. For the last 15 years, it's been held by Irwin Cotler. Now that Cotler, a man with great admiration and respect, not only in Parliament but also in his riding, now that he's retiring, you've got a real horse race on between Robert Libman for the Conservatives and Anthony Housefather for the Liberals. These are two Jewish leaders in the community. Mount Royal is a heavily Jewish riding, but it's not exclusively Jewish. It's not even majority Jewish. So one of the myths that's being put out there is that Harper went there and was going to push the issue of Israel. Not really. He did talk about Israel in relation to the overall issue of national and global security, but he used it to act as a juxtaposition between where he stands on certain issues and where the NDP and Liberals stand.
You know, my friends, I'm always amazed, and I hope you notice how the Liberals and NDP are always criticizing us for not being friendly enough with Iran, but for being too friendly with Israel.
Just as he will do across the country, Stephen Harper will use the issue of national security as a wedge issue to differentiate himself between the Liberals and the Conservatives, between Harper and Mulcair and Trudeau. That's going to happen, but just because he was in Mount Royal doesn't mean he was just pushing the issue of Israel. He was also talking about the economy and the fact that he has a different view than the current front-runner and the front-runner in Quebec, Tom Mulcair, and the NDP.
Mulcair wants to raise taxes, but he was way off when asked what tax rates actually are. Now, friends, that is about the best description of NDP economic policy I have ever heard.
All right, so those are a couple of the myths out of the way, that Harper was just going there to court the Jewish vote and it was all about Israel. No, very little about Israel, and despite the riding being heavily Anglophone, I found that probably the majority of the speech was in French, at least from Stephen Harper. Let's talk about another myth, the idea that the Conservatives aren't even players in Quebec. This is something that I've been hearing the entire time I've been covering politics, and once upon a time, it was true. Back in 2000, my first federal election, covering it in Montreal, Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister. Guess what? They took 36 out of 75 seats. The Bloc Québécois took 38. And one went to the Progressive Conservatives. So that was back then. Move ahead, the Liberals have been losing seats in every election in Quebec since 2000. They only won 21 seats under Paul Martin in 2004. When you get to 2006, the Liberals only won 13 seats to the Conservatives 10. In 2008, they won 14 to the Conservatives 10. And then in 2011, with the Orange Crush coming across, the Conservatives won 5 seats, the Liberals won 7. Both of them had their seat totals cut in half. Right now, the Liberals hold 9.3% of the total seats in Quebec. The Conservatives hold 6.6%. This is not a vastly different number. And the fact is, Justin Trudeau doesn't have support off the island of Montreal, where they lost seats in the last election. The Conservatives have support in Quebec City, but they also have support elsewhere in the province and could win. In my view, they have more upside in Quebec than the Liberals do. But you will hear time and again this myth that the Conservatives are just not players. Don't believe it. Total garbage. I listened to this myth in 2006 when the Conservatives were saying they hope for 3 to 6 seats. I predicted they win more, and they won 10. The people on the plane that I was with traveling coast to coast with the Prime Minister, well, as he was then, opposition leader Stephen Harper, couldn't believe that he would ever win 10 seats in Quebec. It could happen again. Don't believe the hype, don't believe the myths. This myth is that the Liberals dominate in Quebec. They don't, and they haven't for a long time. Pop quiz for you. When was the last election that the Liberals took the majority of seats in Quebec? You have to go all the way back to 1980 when Pierre Trudeau was still the Liberal leader. They haven't since. Mulroney swept in 84, he swept in 88, and since then it's been the Bloc and now the NDP. This is a province that is at play in this election, so keep an eye on it. But of course, as we see more seats added in Alberta, in British Columbia, in Ontario, in the suburban areas, Quebec does become less important. It's still important, but it's not the be-all and end-all that it was back when Trudeau said, "Screw the West, we'll take Quebec."